the general picture, I would love to talk about the guide. I actually love it so much. I'm going to put that on the front of Parent-Educator.org and just have that be like the thing. I think it's a great overview of not just, specific choices, but just the landscape. So maybe you could just introduce yourself and introduce the book, and then we can follow it where it goes.
Sure. So I'm Kerry McDonald. I'm a senior education fellow at FEE, the Foundation for Economic Education, which is the country's oldest libertarian think tank, founded in 1946. I'm also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, regular Forbes contributor, and the author of the book Unschooled: Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that was published in 2019. And received quite a bit more interest in 2020 or 2020 to 2021, as so many families suddenly found themselves learning at home or were considering homeschooling. And then this past spring, actually just in June, I published a free ebook through FEE called the 2021 Curious Parents Guide to Education Options, that really looks at kind of this current moment, the impact of the school shutdowns and the pandemic response, and how it has really transformed education, and I think will continue to transform education. We saw, of course, in the spring of 2020, some 50 million US K-12 children suddenly sent home from their classrooms and learning at home in this sort of crisis homeschooling or pandemic homeschooling. But I thought one of the most interesting early inklings I saw that this could be the beginning of something big was in April of 2020. EdChoice put out a survey of parents, finding that more than half of them had a more favorable view of homeschooling after the school shutdowns than they did before. And I remember thinking, as a homeschooling parent myself, gosh, if families think that this kind of crisis homeschooling is at least somewhat tolerable, just imagine the real thing. And so sure enough, we did see over the course of the previous academic year, a tripling of homeschooling rates, independent homeschooling rates, parents unenrolling their children from a school for homeschooling. And that was a tripling from pre-pandemic levels to now more than 11% of US K-12 students being homeschooled. That's over 5.5 million kids. And interestingly, this is according to US Census Bureau data that we're getting that number from. They found that the largest driver of this surge in homeschooling rates over the previous academic year came from Black homeschooling families that had a 5-fold increase in homeschooling numbers from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. And actually now Black homeschoolers are overrepresented in the homeschooling population compared to the representation in the overall K-12 public school population. And if we had this conversation even just a couple of months ago, I would have said, well, I think we'll have a dip in those homeschooling numbers. I think this was a temporary, educational fix for families that were frustrated by school closures or remote Zoom schooling that was a disaster for many kids. And now that it's looking like schools are going to reopen for full-time in-person learning, we'll see families kind of flood back into these classrooms and leave homeschooling behind. Now, I don't think that's the case at all. And in fact, the Associated Press backs me up on this. They had an article just a couple of weeks ago suggesting that many of these homeschooling families, if not most of them, will continue to opt for homeschooling, even though their local schools are open for full-time in-person learning. I think especially now that we see ongoing virus concerns for many parents, mask policies that anger parents on both sides, there's sort of a no-win situation. There's some parents who are pulling their kids out of school because their schools are mandating masks for kids, and other parents that are pulling their kids out of school because their schools are not mandating masks for kids. That's creating battles, but is leading to families making different choices. And I think, the ongoing social distancing expectations and these quarantines, I've been posting on Twitter recently, school has just started in some parts of the country, just a week and a half ago. And already in many schools, you have entire classrooms, entire, fourth grade classes that are in quarantine because, of possible exposure to the coronavirus because maybe one teacher or staff, or the teacher, staff member, or student had some symptoms. And I think so it's really going to be another incredibly disruptive academic year. And I think a lot of families are saying, we're going to continue homeschooling, or we're going to start homeschooling because we want our kids to have a much calmer, more settled, more predictable school experience or learning experience.
So that's interesting, and I'm very curious as to how the numbers bear out. I guess I'm not sure what the kind of go no go dates are for schools in terms of when they actually get their enrollment and they get slapped in the face with reality. But
Yeah.
last year I had lots of conversations with sort of people who had been doing educational entrepreneurship for a long time, providing services, just providing programs for kids. But then up popped up these businesses and pod directories and pod coordinators and pod this and that. And I was very optimistic that supply creates demand, right? Or whichever way you go. I don't know whether those businesses and those resource networks continued and thrived. I mean, you're in your book, there's an amazing array of resources sort of from all over the gamut in terms of what parents can use to support kids. But from your perspective, is the support network, substantially bigger and better now? So if somebody is homeschooling or somebody's forced into homeschooling, that they can plug in and it doesn't feel like as much of a drop off as sometimes it does for homeschoolers in a non-pandemic environment?
Well, let me address your first point and then move on to kind of opportunities and resources for homeschooling families. The first point is that typically in most states, you'll have a sense of sort of the new academic year enrollment by early October. And that's when very often school districts have to report to the state. Typically their funding is related to overall school enrollment. Last year, there was a funding freeze so that schools were not dinged because they may have had fewer students. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out going forward. But we do have some early indications that this year will continue to lead to an exodus in overall public school enrollment. We saw last year data suggesting that public school enrollment was down 2 to 3% nationwide, in some states down as much as 5% or more. And this year we're seeing similar trends. New York City, for example, kindergarten registrations were down 12% compared to last year. The New York Times just had an article over the weekend suggesting that kindergarten enrollment is still going to be down this year. They talked about the kindergarten exodus as parents decide not to enroll their kids, younger kids, in school, or to pull them out for homeschooling or other kinds of private or virtual options that are not connected to their district. They mentioned one school, for example, in Hawaii that has kindergarten enrollment down 42%. They just started their academic year last week, and they're down 42% compared to kindergarten enrollment in 2019. So I think we have these indicators that families are fleeing their government schools and are looking for other options, and that gets to kind of your second point: what's available to them. I think that's I can answer that in sort of two ways. One, the first would be, whenever I'm asked by prospective homeschooling families, where do I go first? I always suggest connecting with local homeschooling communities, in particular, homeschooling Facebook groups that exist for almost all local areas or regions, or other kinds of social networks, to really tap into the community available. And I think you've seen these Facebook groups really grow over the past year, that most of them have been very welcoming to prospective families coping with some of these educational disruptions. And it can be a way of, figuring out what kinds of resources, curriculum, activities, social opportunities are available to people in that local area. So that's sort of my number one suggestion. But then you also see, I think, one of the great silver linings over the past year and a half has been the surge in education entrepreneurship, particularly in the out of school learning, homeschooling, alternative education space. I write about some of them in my new ebook that we're referring to here, and I have a new article coming out, in just a few days, about all of these other companies that are sprouting to create some of these new opportunities. Some of them are really trying to facilitate these pandemic pods or these learning pods that began to gain popularity last summer as parents realized that back to school was not going to be in any way normal and wanted their kids to have an in-person social experience. And so they would get together with other families and hire an educator or a college student or some other facilitator, or they would take turns as parents to facilitate a curriculum or supervise kids in each other's homes. And this was really sort of a modern twist on, or a pandemic twist on the microschool movement, which had been gaining traction for several years prior to the coronavirus, where you had these, really successful academic learning pod programs. I think of Acton Academy as one of the nation's leaders. There's also Prenda Learning out of Arizona. They've since expanded to other states, but again, leading the way in the microschool movement of this kind of multi-age, home-based, facilitator-led learning experience, typically with proprietary curriculum software and so on. And so that's just continuing now with so much more demand and so many entrepreneurs really entering that space. I think of, and I talk about in the ebook, a company startup called GetSchoolhouse.com, which just raised several million dollars in a venture capital round this past spring. They connect families eager to form one of these learning pods with a certified teacher in a particular area. And it's really taking off. And there's similar education entrepreneurs doing, similar things. And I'll also say too that one of the downsides perhaps of the past year is that I think it has put a stain on virtual learning in ways that I am really concerned about, because I hope that families don't take away from their dismal Zoom district schooling experience the idea that virtual learning or remote learning options are subpar. In fact, they're just the opposite. And there's so many to choose from and so many emerging every day. And nothing like Zoom schooling that most families had to contend with over the past year. I mean, most of these private online learning providers are extremely high quality. They were designed to be online, so they have the functionality for that. They have the platform for that. They have educators who are eager to teach in that kind of format. They have a curriculum that is, again, designed for remote learning and for self-paced learning. And so I really hope that the families realize that there are so many more opportunities available to them in the remote learning space, and particularly as prospective homeschoolers, that enable them to kind of continue with a curriculum or continue with some kind of organized learning approach without being required to go to a brick and mortar school every day.
It's such a good point. It is. It's like, don't entrust the people that we're already saying kind of take a one size fits all approach. And that's part of the problem with public schooling. And then say, well, go do online, and then look at that as the model for how it's supposed to be done, right? I mean, you see the diversity of options that you see with all these different programs. That's what you're looking for. I think every time somebody unschools or deschools or homeschools, it creates an opportunity, because it can be contagious, because somebody is a pioneer. Somebody is the one who normalizes that process. Is that what it takes to sort of break the cartel of government schools from your perspective?
I think absolutely. I think there's a lot less reticence now on the part of parents to try homeschooling, that it's much more accepted. And in fact, I mentioned the EdChoice poll that came out in April of 2020, showing more than half of families having a favorable view of homeschooling or more favorable view of homeschooling compared to pre-pandemic. That percentage has only gone up. I think it's now sort of maybe the latest is 64% of families having a more favorable view of homeschooling. So I think that, again, as we reach this sort of critical mass in homeschooling, combined with all of these resources available to homeschoolers, we'll just continue to see homeschooling as really the umbrella term for encouraging education innovation and alternatives to conventional schooling. I'll go back to your first point about football. I think a lot of states have passed what are known as Tim Tebow laws, that named after the football player who was homeschooled, the Tim Tebow laws enable homeschooled students to participate in local school athletics or extracurricular programs. In some cases, they have to meet certain requirements or, take standardized tests associated with the school district. So there may be some hoops if they decide to opt into district extracurriculars or athletics, but it's often worth it to families if they have a child that's really interested, for example, in being on the local football team or the local soccer team. And so those are expanding and gaining traction as well. And then, I think, again, this idea that there are just so many resources available to homeschoolers now, that they realize they don't have to be tied to their local district school. It's just been a tremendous year of parent empowerment, since the spring 2020 shutdowns. Finally, parents are put back in charge of their children's education in ways unimaginable pre-pandemic. For one, they got a close-up glimpse at what was actually happening in their children's schools, what their kids were learning or were not learning. In many cases, they were appalled by the sort of academics or ideology that their kids were being fed. So it was a real eye-opener for a lot of families. And for other families, it was just an opportunity to realize that education and government schooling can be separated, that there are these other options. That's what I try to explain in the book, that really are accessible to them. Now, in terms of what's going to facilitate this exodus? What I think is the number one thing that's going to facilitate this exodus are the teachers' unions. They are the ones that stymied school reopenings last fall and throughout the previous academic year, showing that teacher union influence was the number one factor on whether or not schools reopened for full-time learning the past academic year. Studies out of Brown University confirm this as well. And I think we're still seeing teachers unions sort of signaling that there may be sort of barriers to schools reopening or staying open in certain communities. So I think honestly, they're the best advocate, I suppose, for parents leaving a district school for some other options this year.
Right. Well, and so to your book and getting your book out to, I think about it in terms of getting it out to homeschooling groups who, of course, like you're saying, are the ones who are, if somebody is searching, if somebody's saying, well, how do I homeschool in this area? There's so many different resources. An amazing wealth of resources at a national level and a state level. And then at a local level, you're alluding to the Facebook groups. And then there are long-standing co-ops in lots of different, in every area around the country. It's really astounding, the resources that are available. It's the image of somebody just being at home and alone, and their kids not being able to interact with other kids is such a misperception of how things work. From your perspective, I'm not sure what you're doing to share your book. Is there, I'm just thinking about putting your book out to homeschooling groups. Now, it would be great to get it out to all parents, obviously, but I'm just thinking that those are the groups that people reach out to if they're searching for educational options sometimes. Would that be fair?
Yeah. So again, it's a free ebook available for download at fee.org. You can go to fee.org/Kerry and see the download there. And I think it certainly would be affirming to current homeschooling families, but it's really aimed at families sort of debating what they're going to do over the coming year. Maybe they're families that chose homeschooling last year and are still trying to figure out what they're going to do this coming year, or new families that, again, are just realizing that this year is going to be just as disruptive educationally as the last, and are starting to consider some other options. And so I talk about homeschooling, I talk about learning pods and microschool networks, I talk about high quality private virtual learning options, I talk about private school options. Again, private schools, for the most part, were able to stay open safely and successfully last year, while many public schools didn't. And so I think more families are investigating private schools and maybe realizing that they are more accessible to them than they might have otherwise thought. Many private schools are not prohibitively expensive in certain areas. There's other private schools that are eager to recruit new families and offer generous scholarship or financial aid packages. And so it shouldn't be something that parents think is not available to them, that in fact they may be surprised just how available private schools are in their local area.
So just to that point about that tipping point, I mean, that's my dream, is that there's this tipping point where um, it's not just, again, that pattern interrupt last year was very exciting as an opportunity for independent learners and non-traditional education. Do you see, I mean, you're saying this, if the schools don't open, then obviously people have to look in other places. There are people who are frustrated with the mask mandates. People are frustrated with, they're having curriculum discussions all around the country with regards to critical race theory and certain school boards, et cetera. But like, do you see this being a pivotal year? I mean, you've been studying this for long enough that you have a great perspective. Do you see this being a watershed year for homeschooling or non-traditional education in this country?
Absolutely. I think this is really a moment of massive education transformation, and we're continuing to see it. Again, as I said, if you had asked me a couple months ago, I might have been less optimistic, but now I think that the momentum for families leaving district schools is, if anything, gaining speed, not slowing down. So I think we'll continue to see families seeking other options and continue to see entrepreneurs and educators step in to provide those options. I think that's where there's, so much opportunity there. Yeah. In terms of a tipping point, I mean, I think we're well on the way to that. I think another piece of it is the fact that we see record high support for school choice policies. The most recent Real Clear Opinion Research survey shows that I think it's something like 74% of taxpayers are now supportive of education dollars following students instead of school systems. And many states have already passed legislation over the past year that enables funding, again, to go to families instead of schools. And you see more and more of that. So as local government schools are not meeting the needs of parents and are continuing to frustrate taxpayers who are paying for closed schools or schools that are, again, not meeting their constituents' needs, we'll see, declining support for local schools. And I think that's really what's going to ultimately lead to this kind of tipping point where we're starting to support families instead of bureaucratic school systems. Say, because you mentioned TK Coleman, who's FEE's Director of Entrepreneurial Education, his workshops at schools around the country are and homeschool groups around the country are incredibly well received. They're all free. All of FEE's workshops are free on entrepreneurship, economics and government, personal finance, and so on. So that's also a great resource to tap into and get these guys out to individual groups of students, particularly high school students across the country. And then, you can find my email and social media accounts at fee.org/Kerry.
And Kerry, you mentioned this in your book, but FEE has some incredible resources that are geared towards young people at the Learning Center. And so if somebody is looking to supplement their homeschooling education, you could do a lot worse. I was just touring some of those resources today, and one of the most frustrating things, you kind of allude to it, is people talk about, well, if you did open up the cartel, and if you did allow the money to follow the students, well, people can't afford these $50,000 a year private schools, or they can't do this or that. But as we see, if there is demand, if you actually open it up and allow people to have choice, you see this incredible explosion of supply. And you guys are doing it for free, and you talk about Acton, and you talk about OutSchool, and all of these pods and all these Khan Academy, all these different programs. I mean, really, that supply is springing up to support 3% of the public schooling population. What happens when it's 11%? What happens when it's 20%? You don't have less choice. You don't have fewer resources that pop up. So it really would be heartening for people to look around and say, there's not going to be a shortage of people who want to provide support for students. That's not going to be the problem.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note, I talk about it a little bit in the ebook and much more at length in my actual unschooled book, that about the history of compulsory government schooling. And it's a relatively recent phenomenon, started in the mid-19th century. And prior to that, education was much more broadly defined and diversely practiced. There were all kinds of education options available. And once states started passing compulsory schooling laws and forcing attendance at local public schools, these private schools evaporated because they could no longer compete with the quote unquote free public schools, most of them. We're seeing a similar trend now, unfortunately, with the push towards universal pre-K programs, preschool programs, subsidized government childcare programs, pushing out local providers. In fact, the Chicago Tribune just last month had an article on the death of small daycares in the greater Chicago area, mostly that were run by women and people of color who were having to shutter their business because they could no longer compete with the city's free, quote unquote, free universal government preschool programs. And so what we want to do in terms of unleashing the free market to provide more and varied options for families in terms of education resources is to limit the size and scope of government.
No, that's fantastic. Kerry, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to share?
No, I just encourage everybody to follow my writing and my work at fee.org/Kerry. You can find a link to the ebook, a link to my unschooled book, and also sign up for my weekly email newsletter, Liberated.
Absolutely. And it's a fantastic newsletter. Definitely recommend everybody subscribe to it. And you can also access the ebook online. Now, the ebook doesn't look like you have to register to get to it. Is it? Do you just want people to also register for the newsletter as well, correct?
Yeah, I mean, you can actually read the ebook. Even you don't have to download it to your ebook reader. You can read it right from the website if that's preferable to you. It's again available for free. I think depending on how you access the book, if you go to fee.org/books, you'll see it there and be able to download it for free. Sometimes if you're clicking on a pop-up, it might ask for your name and email address, in which case you'll be added to my Liberated newsletter automatically, but you can access the book several ways.
And there are amazing resources, and it's really a comprehensive sort of directory and history and overview of what's currently going on. It's amazing for anybody, as the title implies, anybody who's curious about options. This is a great resource, and we're very thankful that you put the time and energy into this, and to Fee for supporting you.
Okay, well, thanks again for having me on to talk about it.
Thanks so much, Kerry.